Good morning. This is being recorded on October 2nd, and some of you may say, there she goes again talking about Africa when all these problems in the world, like Ukraine and China and so forth, why in the world is she talking about Africa? I would like to propose to you this morning that what's going on in Africa is essentially mirroring what's going on in the world to some extent. It's also central in many ways to what's going on in other parts of the world that we're interested in. And it's very central to the future of the world and world affairs. You will recall, just to repeat in a sense something I've said before, that we tend to think of Africa as this distant place down there on the map. And you will recall that into the confines of that continent fits the entire USA, India, all of Europe, China, Argentina, New Zealand, and a few other countries. In short, it's a huge place. Second of all, the population of the continent is said to be around 1.4 billion right now. That's an educated guess. But the assumption also is that sometime in the century, maybe 20 to 25% of the world population will be African. So it's a big chunk of the world. But then, of course, that doesn't as yet say anything about why one thinks focusing on Africa is somehow illuminating to many of the issues that are going on in the world right now. You will recall last time I talked about the global South and how China and Russia have become sort of attached or have attached themselves to the global South. And as a consequence, the support that Europe and the United States and a few other industrial countries are receiving in a huge chunk of the countries of the world has been diminished. You might have noticed recently in the United Nations, very difficult to get a vote, even in the General Assembly, on many of the issues that concern the industrial countries and concern the United States, let's say, with respect to the Ukraine and other matters. Now, the one thing, of course, that we've talked about in the past is the increasing authoritarianism all over the world. And one of the things that I think we need to think about is some explanation for it. But before saying something about that, the authoritarianism is pervasive on the African continent and is pervasive in the global South in general. And so the question, of course, arises, why is this so? Why are those countries increasingly turning to authoritarianism? Let us remind ourselves that the same thing is happening in the so-called industrial West. It is the case that in many countries, including heretofore very democratic countries, the parties that are picking up support, whether it's in France or whether it's in Italy or any other European countries, including the Scandinavian countries, the right-wing parties are picking up support, often getting as much as 20% of the vote in those countries. Looking at the US, it's not hard to see to what extent a huge portion of the population is willing to follow Trump. And certainly by any standards, what Trump says he is doing, has done, and will do in the future is very authoritarian in nature. So democracy and liberal democracy is seemingly in decline everywhere. And so why is it also not present in Africa? Well, as a sort of general and generic point, it's useful to point out that when people feel hopeless, when people feel their governments are not improving their situation, very often people who have simple answers leap to mind and get support. And in general, in most countries in the world right now, people are unhappy with their situation. They feel insecure. And on the African continent, they not only are unhappy and feel insecure, but people are literally dying from diseases, from malnutrition in ways that one thought, or they thought even, were not to be expected 50 years, somewhere between 50 and 60 years after the end of colonialism. So focusing on Africa for the moment, most African countries have modernized since the end of colonialism in the sense that a small portion of the population is now connected to the modern, educated, tuned-in world. But the masses of the population very often are still at the stage that they were decades ago, with not adequate food, insecurity in every imaginable way, and especially with climate change, also confronting disasters that neither their government nor anybody else seems to be able to do something about. So one of the obvious situations in Africa is that it is symptomatic not just of malgovernance on the African continent, but symptomatic of some world trends. And here, one of the important considerations is, of course, climate change. Climate change is changing how people live in many parts of the world, but especially in tropical countries, it's not just a question of some occasional floods or higher temperatures, but circumstances which also make it almost impossible to survive, which in turn leads to internal migration within countries into urban areas, which rather than improving the quality of life, are creating more slums, more disasters, more hardships, and then produces the attempt to migrate even outside the countries. And so when both in the United States and very much in Europe, people are looking at the migration problem, in our case, coming largely from the south of the border, but in Europe, in large measure coming from Africa, the question is, why are people leaving in despair and often losing their lives as they cross the Mediterranean? Well, it's not hard to understand. They can't make a living at home. The situation seems to be hopeless economically and climatologically. And on top of everything else, the population is young, much younger than in the industrial countries. And so people feel hopeless. So young adults, parents with children and so forth are migrating out of the African continent. And the migrations that are happening in Europe, as I said, more so than they are happening, of course, in this country where it's from South America, are then creating further havoc in the world and further pushing countries to support right-wing people who have obvious agendas, which say they can fix everything and stop everything. So while this sounds a little disorganized, let me say that climate change and migration, consequent of climate change, both internal to countries and internationally, is not only rife in many parts of the world, but is an absolute disaster, not only internal to the African continent, but between the African continent and the rest of the world. In many ways, the problems of Africa are mirror what is happening in some other parts of the world. For example, during some years after the end of the Cold War, there was migration of East Europeans into West Europeans to work, and even that proved to be disorienting in the politics of countries like France and England and Germany, for example. So the interconnectedness of the world and the fact that you have this huge continent sits at the sort of bottom in the south of the world, and the fact that both global issues and local issues not only occur, that are destabilizing economically, politically, culturally, climatologically, it creates a problem inside African countries and on the continent, but it's also, as I said, both mirroring what's going on in the rest of the world, but also the rest of the world suffers from the consequences of a huge continent and a large population that needs to be addressed somehow. And in the midst of all of this comes the particularity of the African continent, namely that the former colonial powers, especially the French, but also to some extent the English and the Portuguese, kept their hands in the affairs of those countries. And it is recognized in Africa, and it is recognized in many African countries that, in fact, rather than producing an improvement in the socioeconomic circumstance of the country, what they essentially did was extract further from the African continent, whether it's minerals, whether it's labor, whether it's access of one kind or another, have continued to extract from the African continent. And that, in a sense, this sort of neo-colonialism has also, and is also to blame right now by Africans and others, observers, for the bad situation in many countries in Africa. And not surprisingly, the consequence of some of this is not that the governments which were elected or the democratic processes that were put in place by the colonizers have now either completely eroded or are on the process of eroding. So you get country after country who are having coups or elections which then elect authoritarians which don't leave the stage at the end of their term of office. So any kind of hope for a kind of a democratic structure producing improvements that are visible to the population has essentially eroded over the past decades. So now what you have on the African continent is destabilization produced by economic circumstances, climatological circumstances, but also political circumstances. And enter into this maze of erosion of stability and improvement are then the major actors in the world. I already mentioned that the European colonials have essentially been chucked out in the last few months. The French have had to withdraw. You've probably seen in the paper from countries like Mali, like Upper Burkina Faso, like Niger, most recently, even Gabon. They've had essentially decided, the French and Macron in France has essentially decided, we're going to get out of this mess. And they've pulled out their military and sort of thrown up their hands. Enter people who are trying to capture the support, both political and the economic influence in this large continent, namely Russia and China. You've all read a lot about the Wagner Group, which was very busy occupying itself, supporting various jihadist groups or governments that had overthrown more democratic governments. And of course, the Wagner Group is fizzling and reconstituting itself. But meantime, the Russians are making it very clear that they are going to continue to muck around in the affairs of a large swath of West African countries, some Central African countries as well. So that is Russia. In the meantime, China is busying itself saying, okay, we're here to help, we'll support you. And many African countries, like many Asian countries, have taken loans from China, not able to repay them, but China at the moment is willing to continue in the African continent, helping out, making loans, trying to take over the influence that Western industrial countries had in Africa. So Africa has become a big playing field in the last few months of both the Russians and the Chinese. And as more of the dominoes of stable governments, whether authoritarian or democratic, fall on the African continent, the Russians and the Chinese are very busying themselves at the very time when the focus and the concentration of Europe and the United States, for example, is on the Ukraine and the Russian incursions into that, possible and actual incursions into that part of Europe. So while our attention is focused on by I mean the United States' attention is focused on the Ukraine, for example, the Chinese and the Russians are now the Chinese government, as well as Chinese corporations, the Russian government, now under Putin's control of the military, are very busy trying to get the continent to first take a neutral position, and that is reflected in the votes in the United Nations, for example, and the global South not going along with various arguments about what they need to do, both in terms of opposing Russian incursions in Ukraine, but also in terms of things like climate change, etc. This position of African leaders and the African elite is pretty much, folks, you've created this mess. You're not helping us any. Let's try to get help from those that are willing to currently help us. And those are the Russians and the Chinese. Now you would say, well, do we really care? Does it really matter, whether a military has taken over in Niger one way or the other? Well, let us remind ourselves of several things. The U.S. has important military bases, including the most recent country of Niger, which has had a military coup, has military installations in Niger. And as we speak, they have not closed those because they're fairly central and they hope to keep them open. This is true in some other countries. But the real competition and gamble is not just in the hearts and minds and votes of the Africans, but rather the fact that Africa is full of natural resources, which the industrial countries, be they Western industrial countries, China, Russia, and so forth, badly need in order to service the electric vehicles, the computer chips, the technology, which increasingly we're all dependent on. And these minerals are very often available in African countries, and whoever has access or can prevent access has a big role to play in the future of the economies of the industrial countries. So this is not just, oh, well, it's happening in Africa, it doesn't concern us. It very much concerns us whether or not Western countries have access to the minerals that we need to manage our contemporary industrial and computer and machinery. What it seems to be sort of, oh, well, unfortunately, African countries are now mostly in a big mess, and they aren't getting themselves out of a mess, and it's too bad, but let's hope they sort themselves out, is in fact very foolhardy and short-sighted, because as a matter of fact, some of the resources on the African continent are not only needed by Western industrial countries, but if non-Western countries, for example, China, our competitor, will have access to them or prevent us from having access to them, this will have a short-term, medium-term, and even long-term impact on the well-being of Western countries, the United States. So this is not something we as America can sort of say, well, this is far away. It doesn't really concern us. It's not really going to have an impact. After all, some of these minerals are also available in South America, which is true, but still in all, the access question is an important one. So let me then go back to the issue of climate change. Climate change is a number one issue for the well-being of us all in the world. And climate change and doing something about climate change is also central to what is happening on the African continent, because the rising temperatures, which we know how bad they have been, for example, in Phoenix and Texas this summer, have become almost unlivable in some parts of Africa. Humans cannot survive if the temperature is 135 degrees, right? So this has become a major issue that the world needs to address climate change. And African leaders say, whether they're democratically elected or authoritarian, we're happy to try to make a contribution to climate change. But here you are, folks, only 4% of the problem of global heating is the consequence of anything that's happened on the African continent. And yet the consequence of it for us are very serious. And we don't have the resources to pay to remediate our circumstances, to reduce the current aspects of what we produce in terms of climate change. We need help. And we not only need help in terms of what we're doing, but we need help in terms of addressing the climate change that's taking place worldwide, of which we are in many ways victims. So for years now, it has been argued that African countries are happy and willing to move in the direction of green, to take mediation measures in terms of climate change. But they have always argued, going all the way back into the 70s, we need help with this. And while the industrial countries in the United States sometimes talk big at conferences, essentially African countries have not gotten the help they need to address moving from oil, electricity, gas economies in the modern sector to moving into a more green world. They're willing to, and in many ways they're able to, but they can't do it on their own, they argue. And I would say that they're absolutely right. They need help. The problems that we have globally in terms of climate change was not caused by the African continent, but the African continent is victimized as much as any part of the world by climate change. And unless we address this as a global problem and use taxpayers' money in the US and in Europe and elsewhere to help Africa dig itself out of this, and move in the direction of green, we will be all very sorry. And you might, for those of you who are New York Times reader, you might have seen the articles Sunday and today about mosquitoes. And you're saying, well, what do mosquitoes have to do with this? Well, mosquitoes happen to be one of these insects that have been studied in an attempt to wipe them out with sprays of different kinds, with genetic engineering. And this has been going on for decades in Africa. Some of their best biologists have dedicated themselves on the African continent to figure out how to reduce the mosquito population. And in point of fact, it hasn't been successful because mosquitoes keep morphing from being, absorbing the chemicals or not allowing the chemicals to impact them in a very rapid pace. And currently there's a new disaster because the current mosquitoes in some parts of Africa, and by the way, there's some in Florida already, um, are not responsive to the current sprays and the current genetic engineering, which is very expensive. And by the way, is mostly done by the Gates Foundation. So what's the problem there? Well, the problem there is not just that you get mosquito bites, but that you get malaria and dengue fever and other diseases, which has become a major health issue already in several African countries, promises to spread in the rest of the continent, promises to even visit countries like the United States in the South. And so here we have another issue which is linked in part to climate change, linked in part to the capacity of, in this case, of insects to adjust themselves to new circumstances. And in a situation where we're sitting here in California and we're saying, well, it's too bad, lots more people are dying and are disabled by malaria in Africa, but it doesn't really affect me here in Santa Cruz. Yes, well, maybe not yet, but maybe your relatives in Florida are already at risk. So the interconnectedness of all of these aspects of, on the one hand, the African countries mirroring and reflecting economic instability and incapacity to improve the situation of their people, the political instability caused by the economic and social instability in those countries, the hopelessness that Africans feel about their circumstances that have not improved decade after decade, which leaves them to risk their lives to migrate to countries that then cause instability, right-wing politicians, changes in the cultures of Scandinavian and other countries. All of these are interlinked. And much of this is generated in the African continent or reflected in the African continent. And finally, I want to say that African continent, or at least a chunk of African countries, have become, in a sense, the playing field now of China and Russia, in part because they, in the case of China, have the capacity, and in the case of Russia, have enough capacity to influence militarily. But minimally, they are able to subvert the foreign relations of those countries, and the positions that they're taking at international fora is now heavily influenced by the imposition of an ideology, which is the West has done us no good for decades. They have not helped us. Our situation is not really improving except for a small elite. We are in a hopeless situation, in a global situation where climate change is reprogramming many things and is making things worse. And therefore, we will try to stick together as the global South to try to throw monkey wrenches into any policies, activities, international institutions that are not serving us well. I'm proposing to you that the Africa mirrors and reflects much of the major crisis on a global scale is impacted by issues that we consider minor, or we consider something that's not directly influencing us. But the global interconnectedness, as well as the climate issues, as well as the competition between the United States and China, and those policies all have an impact that is now in a kind of interdependent world where communications are almost instantaneously, where leaders have contacts, where people, even in villages in Africa, can often see, because of iPhones or televisions, how the rest of the world lives and what their circumstances are. And I propose to you that unless some of these issues are addressed in a big hurry, and unless the West and the United States figures out a way to pursue a renaissance of policies, both in international institutions as well as in bilateral policies. I think that we are facing some very dire circumstance in the next decade or two. And Africa, I'm proposing for you, is absolutely central, not only to curtail the problems that the continent generates, political, economic, social, climatologically, but also Africa is very central to fixing some of the aspects of the problems that we are now confronting. Thank you very much. I'll see you in 2 weeks.